Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a non-traditional legal program with your host and trusted advisor, Liz Myska, your guide through the web of life's dilemmas.
Welcome. On today's edition of Connecting the Dots, we will talk about lack of planning. Planning for the inevitable, which we all know will occur at some time or another for all of us in our lives. My guest today is Marianne Delorey. She is a PhD with gerontology, correct?
Correct, yes.
And she is the executive director of Colony Retirement Homes in Worcester. Mm-hmm. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you, Liz.
The clip that preceded the program's opening showed a variety of topics that I would like to dissect in a way and have you assist me with your many, many years of experience. The family depicted seems to be concentrating on what they don't have as opposed to what they have. I'm sure that you've had, over the course of your career, individual instances that you can share with our audience about what happens when people neglect to plan. Any specific examples that come to mind?
I'd love to tell you about a couple of them. Let me start with actually kind of my introduction by fire, actually, if you will. When I was recently in housing, I started working in a building where we had a lot of younger people with disabilities, and this one gentleman who was only in his 50s, we found dead one day. And we went through his records to find next of kin and found absolutely nobody. The only kin listed were the heads of the priest and the rabbi at the local places where he would go and collect tithings. He would go and ask for money from them. So they had no record of family. We knew he wanted some kind of religious aspect to his burial, but with no family and nobody else to stick up for him, he got a pauper's burial, which I know isn't what he wanted. And if he had taken some time to just set aside a few minutes and write down what he wanted upon his death, we could have made that so much better for him. As it was, everything he owned got donated, and we, the people in the building, ended up burying him. It was a very traumatic experience, and something I hope that, if nothing else, we can spare one reader, one listener today.
I just would like to speculate, or have you speculate, why you think he didn't commit anything to writing, why he didn't include a trusted friend with his wishes. Can you just speculate on that?
Sure. I think that most people think it's fear. I think that for most people, they don't want to accept their own mortality, and so they won't even talk about it. They won't bring up the topic to anybody. But it's not just fear of dying. It's also fear of making the wrong decision. And I'll tell you that it's better to make a decision than no decision.
And I think you have an example of the latter, of fear of making a decision. I recall you telling me about a vignette as well with someone who feared making the wrong choice.
Sure. So we had a resident whose daughter and she had gone in and out of contact. And I understand that the daughter had some probably addiction issues. And so she didn't want that particular family member to have keys to her apartment, which I understand, to have an ability to get to her bank account. I get that too. But as a result of not having anything, when her brother showed up to clean out her unit upon her death, we had to say, you know what? We don't know that you're the right person. You need to go to court and get the court to designate you as the right person to clear out this unit. And so that gentleman had to spend a month of his time up here, I believe, who was originally from Florida, going through the legal process to get designated as the court-appointed person. And that was an incredible waste of time. So designating somebody, anybody, would have been better than nothing.
And you bring up an incredible waste of time, but also as an attorney, I can tell you an incredible amount of money.
Yes, yes.
And so not to spare the relatives, but nevertheless, an individual does no one any favors
Correct.
if they impose or leave it, neglect to make the decision for themselves.
Right.
You also bring to mind the fact that family members may or may not be the appropriate choice.
Right.
Do you have an example of that? If you do not, I do.
Why don't you go ahead then?
It seems inevitably that parents always designate their child or want to have parity, equality between their children,
Yes.
even though their children may not be the appropriate selection. For instance, if your child lives in Japan and is the eldest, and you're authorizing that child to make a decision for you, that child may be an appropriate person, may be very responsible, but they are not going to be able to make that decision at a moment's notice because
Right.
they have to be notified
Right.
of that. So I always encourage clients to think about the people that are appropriate for them to select. So it may not be a family member. It may
Correct.
be that someone will crumble if they are put in that position. It may just be too difficult for them to do that. It may be, again, distance-wise, they're too far away. So I always encourage my clients to think in terms of appropriateness, of responsibility. You are imposing on someone the responsibility to speak for you, not to substitute themselves for you, but to speak in your voice. And
Right.
that is what the legal process does, is in the writing, you are designating someone. So I think there needs to be a conversation. And
Right.
again, I would like you to comment on that as well, because I believe that doubles back to the fear factor.
Absolutely.
People are concerned that if they disclose something, that it could potentially be used against them. And I think you have an example of that, if I'm not mistaken, as well.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
I think I could speak to a couple of points. You know, I heard recently about a woman who, she was not able to speak for herself at her end of life. And unfortunately, there wasn't somebody there who the medical people trusted to speak for her. And she was already intubated, and they showed her a picture of the tube and a coffin. And it was such a stark and disturbing way to try to communicate to somebody their choice at such an incredibly important time in her life. That should have been done well ahead of time. Mm-hmm. And there's just no reason to make somebody suffer who's already suffering like that. If you get it done in advance, if you have the conversation well in advance, then you're not going to prolong somebody's agony if that's not what they want.
But again, you bring up a very good point. Unless it's unfortunately at crisis level,
yes.
People tend to sweep it under the rug and think, I'm going to think about this tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
It's not right at my doorstep.
Mm-hmm.
So why should I clutter my life? I'm so involved in every other aspect of my life. Why should I clutter it with morbid thoughts of death?
Right. If you plan in a hurry, your plan is hurried, plain and simple. And in the housing world, which is where I've spent the majority of my career, I can tell you that every week I get at least one phone call of, saying, I need housing for my mother. She's about to come out of assisted living or rehab or the hospital, and I need this now. And inevitably, my response is, well, our shortest waiting list is about 6 months long. And they say, 6 months? But she can't go home. She has stairs. Can't you prioritize her? And unfortunately, the answer is no. At least not in my particular situation. And the same is true for end-of-life planning. If you don't think ahead, you're going to be planning at the wrong point. This is your opportunity to make the plan. And you can think about different scenarios too. It's like, okay, well, who do you trust to water your plants when you're away? Well, maybe they can know where your checkbook is. You know, it's little things like that. It doesn't have to be everything all at once. Take little steps.
You're prompting me to think of entrusting one person to the exclusion of other people, which again could potentially cause trouble. What if that person then, again, a child potentially, skirts elder abuse? Could you comment on that as well?
I'm afraid I have seen my fair share of that. And sometimes it's a loan from mom, and sometimes it's, oh, she'll never know, but I'll return it. And sometimes it's outright stealing. And if you are in the situation where you know you can't trust your children, that's a different situation than finding out that you've been stolen from. There are definitely resources available to people who have been financially abused, certainly through elder services or a competent attorney. But if you suspect that that could be too much of a risk, then what you do is you call your neighbor and say, you know, if I'm going into the hospital and I need my checkbook, can you bring it to me? You know, you set a plan that says, okay, my daughter is only allowed in my apartment under the following circumstances. I'm incapable of, you know, getting my clothes to the hospital or something like that. Set a plan for what you can plan for. You can't plan for somebody else's actions. You can only plan for your own.
What I'm hearing you say as well is you need to demarcate a person to conduct your financial affairs and one potentially to conduct other types of affairs.
Possibly.
Talk to me, because I'm sure that you experienced this, about joint accounts. Do you find your residents automatically think about putting someone else on their checking account? Are they apprehensive about doing that because of the reasons that we've already covered? And what is your advice if someone asks you that?
I'm a big believer in always have somebody else on your account. However, that doesn't work for every family. And, you know, maybe you have, maybe there's a situation where the son who's in Japan actually can do the electronic banking if you're ever in the hospital, or can write out that check and have a spare couple of checks and get those off to whomever needs the money. Maybe there's a way to do your banking electronically so that even if you're in the hospital, you can get your rent paid every month. Maybe you can have a power of attorney locked up in a safe deposit box where it can only be accessed when you're already in a crisis situation. Then somebody could take that power of attorney to the bank and get added to the account then. You know, so if there's the threat of somebody being unscrupulous, you can take steps to prepare for the inevitable in a way that keeps you a little bit more safe.
And again, I hear you saying quite appropriately that you need to project into the future, and you need to, again, have a plan, the plan encompassing documents, but you also need to build in flexibility as well, so that in the event that something happens or circumstances occur that you are technically unprepared for, the documents have enough flexibility in order to permit an alternative. In particular, and I don't want to talk about documents, but there are provisions that can be written into healthcare proxies, durable powers of attorney, that don't make them spring to life until you are deemed medically compromised.
Right.
But those are not the documents necessarily that you would pull off a website or pull off the internet or buy at Staples. Right. So again, and I'm sure, as you just mentioned, the advice always is you need guidance, and that guidance may be in the form of an attorney.
Yes, absolutely. The people are afraid of attorneys, and they really need to think of it like any other trade. You don't do your own plumbing or wiring for a reason, and you don't do your own legal work for a reason. The internet is great for figuring out maybe how to unstop a drain, but you don't want to replumb the entire house all by yourself. The same is true for the law, and certainly there are some really quick answers on the web, but if you're designing your end-of-life documents, you don't want to leave that much to chance. I know of a family who, as with a lot of couples, one has retained their cognitive abilities and one, is medically a little bit more fragile. In this particular situation, the woman, I'll call her Bella, has really serious memory loss. And their will was written when their children were young. Babies, in fact, and at least one of the guardians listed has long since passed away by about 20 years. The man in the family, I'll call him Frank, refuses to see an attorney, and I don't know why, but he does talk about how his cousin did his will way back then, and he charged them for just chatting. And so he's so afraid of an attorney and being taken advantage of that he's compromising his own security. Mm-hmm. Because, as you may or may not know, with Alzheimer's, one of the symptoms can be in belligerence. If he goes to sell the car and her name is on the title and she refuses to sign that, he can't sell the car. Mm-hmm. How is he going to plan? He doesn't have a guardianship for her. There's no power of attorney in place. There's no will in place. It's setting yourself up for disaster. It really is.
And it's tragic.
Right.
But again, you had mentioned at the beginning of this program, and you're repeating it throughout, fear.
Yeah.
Fear of mortality, fear of lawyers, fear of making the wrong choice.
Absolutely.
So how do we, as professionals who are there to assist, how do we overcome that hurdle, in your opinion? How do we encourage people to not necessarily to dispel their fear, but to lessen their fear? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say to take small steps. Well, think about one thing at a time. I think, in my own opinion, the healthcare proxy is the simplest form and the easiest for people to understand and the least fraught with anxiety. If I have a medical condition and I cannot speak for myself, the person I want to speak for me is blank. The alternate is blank. That's really easy for people to get, and so long as that person, you have a conversation about what they want and what they don't want, and you're sure that that person gets what you want, I think that's the easiest form to start with.
I just would want to comment on that. You mentioned a conversation, mm-hmm. and oftentimes I find people understand I need to put something in place, but they select someone, again, the son in Japan, mm-hmm. they never have a conversation mm-hmm. with that son in Japan.
Right.
The writer of the document has presumed that the son in Japan is adequate and will obviously agree. But have you ever had a situation where the son in Japan doesn't know, of the demise of, and gets a phone call in the middle of the night and is asked to render advice to the medical staff of a family member that he wasn't even aware that he was the selection? So I'm getting back to the conversation.
Yes. I haven't seen that because I don't work in a medical setting, but I can imagine it's pretty frequent. I think that the elderly that I see are probably hesitant to bring it up because they don't want their children to worry about them. And the children need to step up to the plate and actually not be afraid to ask the questions. Mom, Dad, do you have these documents in place? I'm not asking for anything. I'm not trying to get myself into your will. I'm not trying to, get that table set. I just want to know, who is the executor, so that if there's a problem, I know who is supposed to be doing what. And families are all multi-dimensional and very dynamic and confusing, and all dysfunctional. Uh, so there's going to be anxiety around all of those conversations. But you have to be greater than the worry. You have to say, all I want to know is who is designated so that I know who's supposed to do what. I don't want to step on somebody's toes.
I just went on to add to that. I believe it's a conversation as well about the types of treatment. I believe that so often members of the public think, I'll just appoint or anoint someone to be my spokesperson, but because the subject matter is distasteful, my death or disability is distasteful, I will not, I don't want to know what kinds of treatment can be imposed upon me. So I don't want to talk about being resuscitated. I don't want to talk about being intubated. I don't want to talk about going on dialysis. My family, because they know me, will know what I want. And I think that that's fraught with peril because it puts the agent in a position of, we never discussed this, and what's appropriate for me may not be appropriate for my loved one.
Right.
And so I believe it's important to have the dialogue. And again, I'm just wondering about a forum for the dialogue. I know that you, in your facilities, you have, I'm sure, guest speakers come in and talk about these things, or offer the opportunity for your residents to make appointments one-on-one. If you could just comment on how successful those are. In other words, do people get off the chair and actually activate this, or do they say, oh, this is more of the same thing, yes, I know I have to do it, but then they never move forward, they never proceed. And that is the crux of what I see, that people understand intellectually that they need to do something, but there's often this disconnect with how do I go about doing it, and because of the fear factor, it's too expensive, or I don't know anyone. And how do we as professionals or as a society create the dialogue so that people, it's okay to talk about these things?
I think, well, I'm not a particularly fearful person, so I have no problem putting people on the spot if needed. So in my position, I can't push people to get those documents, but I can certainly inquire after them. But one thing that I can say is, do you remember when, our resident dropped, literally? You don't want that to happen.
It's a graphic
It's
example.
graphic, and it was very much in their face at the time, and I'm sure they remember it. So it's easy for me to say, you don't want that to happen to you. So let's make a plan for you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. This has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you very much.
I want you to remember me as a trusted advisor guiding you during life's decisions. I'm Elizabeth Myska, attorney. Please call me at 508-753-7681 or visit my website at www.elizabethlmyska.com. Thank you.
Please note that the information provided in this show is not a substitute for consulting with an experienced local attorney and receiving counsel based on the facts and circumstances of a particular transaction. To contact Lizbeth, email her at lizbeth@elizabethlmyska.com or call her office at 508-753-7681. We're online at connectingthedots.lawyer. Executive producers, Lizbeth Myska and Jack Peacock. Producers, John Medberry and Bill Hamilton. A production of Elizabeth L. Myska, J.D., LLM, in association with Compliments.